Ladies, gentlemen, and haradrim of all ladies, we are a bit over a week and a half into Season 7, and while that isn't a particularly long amount of time for the season, I feel like I've already experienced such a large amount of the game and what it has to offer in this season, and that it's a fine point to stop and look back at what we were expecting before the season happened, what it turned into, everything the season has ended up being so far, and my thoughts and feelings on all the changes that have come to the game too. Essentially a review of Season 7, now that I have my second character blasting through deep pit tiers already. First up then, I want to start with seasonal activities themselves. Headhunt is great. I wouldn't be mad if this became a just permanent part of the game after the season ended, because it makes doing Whispers of the Dead something that you can actually focus on as a main activity. It does get a bit repetitive after enough farming, but it's just an interesting activity that could maybe be re-implemented as like an endgame exclusive activity with only like 2 zones active at a time instead of the massive number that we have right now. Basically, as a whole, I just enjoy the Headhunt zone. I think the roots that explode either into piles of loot or turn into boss events are a solid mechanic that just adds a lot of potential for gear upgrading, while also just being dense waves of enemies that's enjoyable to plow through with our strong builds. That said, as for how it relates to this season especially, some of these specific new Grim Favors events tied to it are quite good, even ones like delivering animals to a tree that aren't that off-putting. They are a bit slower to complete than the others, sure, but they're totally fine, and are variety from the previous Grim Favors event, which is a good thing. There's also the Cleansing Pyres events within these that just spawn loads of enemies after you activate them, and those are fantastic for restless rot farming specifically, and as a whole, the amount of zones that this activity is active in at any given time gives us a lot of choice as to how to tackle it too, which is quite a good thing as well. And on top of that, they essentially completely revitalized silent chests as a part of this, making them common spawns within the headhunts, and making them not only give actually decent gear drops, but also sigils for the root holds. On which note, let's talk about the root holds too. These are a fun new mini dungeon activity for the season, and each one has various choices that you have to make, letting you choose 2 ways to make the run harder, but increase the rewards, both at the start, and then before the final larger chamber, you can choose more as well. And the negatives aren't overly bad either, while the positive bonuses feel pretty decent in early game and in very early endgame, but start to feel totally outscaled by the time you reach higher Torment. Overall, root holds were great as a vehicle for the seasonal questline, and they were great for the first few hours after hitting level 60 as well, which I think is fine as a use for 1 out of the 2 seasonal activities we were given, as headhunts are still incredibly rewarding even on Torment 4, and they do last. Both of these activities are also tied to the witchcraft system and Occult Gems as well, and for witch powers in general, I think the system is fantastic. It's not overly complex. You can get the vast majority of the actual witch power options very early in your journey, and then you can just get more effective with these as you upgrade them as you go. That said, there are also the lost powers too, which feel like they could have maybe been a bit more common than they are to find, because theoretically with the elixir active on Torment 4, it is a 10% chance to spawn this in a dungeon, nightmare dungeon, pit, or root hold, but I've done hundreds of these activities put together and seen 6 altars total personally, while running the elixir constantly as well. That said, you could argue that this gives a more longer term goal within a season where everything else comes online so fast, a way for players to keep potentially gaining power as they go, but I do think that there is another thing that takes this role much better this season in the Occult Gems. So if they bring back mechanics like this concept in future seasons, higher rate of appearance would be generally appreciated than what we got. Aside from that, I do of course have to mention the various bugs surrounding this system as well, with the Force of Will power allowing infinite scaling for the first few days, Soul Harvest working really unintuitively for a while before it was fixed, and the whole recent set of events with Decay Augmentation infinitely scaling up damage over time, mainly for Sorcerer and Spiritborn, boosting both of those classes from about a tier 120 top pit completion up to a tier 150 within hours of the interaction being found by players, which then of course resulted in the power being fully disabled until the patch hits next week to fix this issue before bringing the power back online. This whole set of events is pretty unfortunate, but bugs are bugs. They happen, and outside of the bugs themselves, I've really enjoyed the system for what it is. Mistakes happen, but the devs are at least responding and trying to fix them, so the situation could be much worse. That said, there's also the Occult Gems as part of the system too. These are quite interesting in their own right. They give a solid pile of defensive stats to have in your gear to begin with, but the effect can have quite a large impact on the effect of a build overall. A big example being Voice of the Stars, giving ultimate skills all witchcraft tags, and how they just perfectly lean into the witch power system, and the fact that they also added functionality to all of the ultimate skills in Season 7 in general, so by doing this they make ultimate skills even more powerful as a result, and lean into the changes they're making to the game at large. That said, as much as I like how these gems affect the builds that we have, we do need to talk about the grind to actually get the Occult Gems. A blue rarity Occult Gem requires 1 fugitive Fugitive Head, which are dropped by the bosses of the same name that are random chance to appear as head-rotten bosses in Torment difficulties, and these aren't the end of the world to find in higher Torment by any means. Then the gem also requires 1000 Restless Rot, which is definitely quite a large number, don't get me wrong. However, especially after they boosted Restless Rot drop rate within the recent hotfix, this hasn't felt crazy to me to get by any means, to farm by just doing headhunts. But then they also require 50,000 gem fragments to craft each one. The yellow rarity Occult Gems require 2 blue Occult Gems, so 2 heads, 2,000 Restless Rot, and 100,000 combined gem fragments, but then crafting the yellow rarity gem itself also costs 75,000 gem fragments too, so 175,000 combined fragments for a yellow rarity gem. Then a legendary Occult Gem requires 2 blue Occult Gems, as well as a yellow Occult Gem, and then an extra 100,000 gem fragments on top of that for a grand total of 4 Fugitive Heads, 4,000 Restless Rot, and 375,000 combined gem fragments. That said, last season gem fragments were actually dropping in such ridiculously high quantity that they actually lowered the drop rate of these because players were becoming overfilled on them in the endgame. But with this lower drop rate this season has become a proper grind to actually get your Occult Gems because they're an actual way to spend lots of gem fragments, which is the hardest thing to actually grind to get the highest rarity Occult Gems too. I'm at the point where I have 2 legendary Occult Gems and I have my magic one as well, but because of that, even as much as I've played, I don't have the highest rarity of emeralds in my gear, which is sort of crazy to say to me at this point too. And as well, it's worth mentioning, this is a hefty grind, yet I say this as someone who finished the grind less than a week into the season, which, while slow compared to pretty much everything else now, isn't like problematically slow. It means even the people who play more casually than I do will end up having their gems as a long-term goal. Definitely achievable before the end of the season, at least without a doubt. So I honestly don't really mind this. Maybe it could have higher Restless Rot costs and lower gem fragment costs so we aren't struggling for regular gems too as a result, but I don't mind the timing of it as much as I thought I did on like day 2, when it looked nearly impossible to grind out the full set of 3. Aside from that then, there's just the armory itself as a big important new system too. This has just been absolutely lovely. It lets me have multiple different builds to swap between with minimal effort once set up, and I absolutely love that this exists now. I mean, we've been asking for it for ages, but I do have 3 specific gripes as points of improvement for the future here. The first is the position of them, where in some towns, the armory is just really out of the way compared to others, like the one in the Whispers town is fantastically placed. The second and third are both sort of overlapping, which is that I hope in future there's a way to have armory build swapping also be able to save and load legendary aspects and gems within the sockets of gear. I understand why that is harder than the rest of the system, just equipping gear that is within your stash, as you would essentially have to automatically imprint and move gems around as you do this, but the ideal version of the armory system, at least in my mind, would definitely be able to make these changes too, to let you use the same equipment between multiple different builds just a little bit easier. The season journey then also saw a few updates this season. It definitely feels better than it did before. I did the vast majority of the objectives just passively doing things I was already looking to do, with the main exception being any of the objectives that were to do Helltide, of course, which this season just felt pretty much totally replaced by headhunts. The rewards, however, were nice from the season journey, and I'm honestly a really big fan of having a cool, unique pet as the main reward for the final chapter too. Aside from that, progression this season was very, very quick. Whether that's good or bad is sort of a personal opinion thing, but I enjoy being able to get into the endgame and into a proper build sooner rather than later, so I had a good time this season. As well, alt leveling, as in secondary characters, is super easy this season due to Whisper the Dead being a main part of the headhunt mechanic too, so you can just make a bunch of caches on your main character, send them over to your alternate character, level them up super quickly, and then also the fact that not only do paragon levels carry over as they did last season, but the witchcraft power progress carries over between characters too, so you can instantly have all of your witchcraft powers and levels in them that you had from your main character. I also really like that they've made class mechanic unlocks automatic if you have done them before. It felt great starting the season as a druid specifically, and not having to stop and do a stronghold and a whole little quest line before I could actually use my spirit boons, and making the actual unlocks automatic too, so you don't have to collect all of the materials as well to make this happen. These changes across the board, I was actually quite happy with. That said, I've also felt like I've sort of completed a lot of what I care about the season within the first week even, which is extremely quick, even for a recent Diablo season. There are arguments to be made, of course, that this season they wanted it to be fast so that players could do multiple builds and could properly use the new armory feature that's finally been added, but I think for a lot of players, this progression speed is just resulting in a really short time actually spent playing the game in Season 7 compared to most other seasons. But of course, I'd love to hear thoughts from that about you guys in the comments too, especially for people who don't blast quite as quickly as I do. Maybe this will somehow wind up in you playing longer. I mean, I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Other than that, just sort of the feely changes that happened, like the fact that the only thing stopping me from masterworking right now are either gold or obdicite, and that feels correct, for lack of a better word, as both of those have clear paths to farming more of them in large amounts, as opposed to last season where we were getting walled by iron chunks and rawhide pretty early on. That said, aside from specifically gem fragments, I've not found myself lacking for any crafting material. Even elixirs and incense have been just sort of an automatic thing. I have so many herbs that I have no need to think about whether an activity deserves an incense or not, because I just have them active all the time. They're basically a permanent part of my build at this point, and I think that's perfectly fine for what the system is in endgame. Then finally, I just wanted to note that the bartering system in the Mercenary Den feels a lot better too. Better rewards from the caches, and I've actually had some legendary aspect upgrades that showed up when bartering here too as a source for them, so it's definitely better than it was last season, absolutely. As a whole then, I think the season is quite the success. They put in a lot of effort into the actual seasonal stuff this time around, and they stuck the landing on it quite well as far as I'm concerned. The power-up systems are very solid in Season 7, there's a lot of progression that you can gain quickly, but also some other parts of it that are more of a grind to acquire, and on the whole I think the game is just in a better state now than it was 3 months ago, which is a good thing to be able to say. That just about does it for today then, everyone. A sort of review on Season 7 and how it's been so far from my perspective at least. I've played a ton of it over the first week, 2 characters and proper endgame builds. I've enjoyed a lot of the different changes through the game too, and outside of pushing it into higher pit tiers or exploring different builds, I feel like I've had the Season 7 experience really in its totality. I hope you've enjoyed this and of course feel free to leave any of your own thoughts down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world our stage. Goodbye.